My number 6 best chess game of the 1920s is a spectacular king hunt between the famed players Imbaud and Strumilo. Of course, just there, I'm kidding. There's a reason that you haven't heard of these players. Strumilo has 0 other games in the database, and Imbaud has 1 game fragment that he lost. Now, how can 2 players who are such unknowns produce a masterpiece? Well, the answer is that this is correspondence chess, a discipline that allows amateurs to push their skills to the absolute limit. In over-the-board chess, it would be an astonishing feat for an amateur player to offer the queen sacrifice scene in this game and then calculate all of the spectacular variations through to their finish. But in correspondence chess, a dedicated amateur player can achieve just such a feat of calculation. Imbaud opens the game here with pawn to e4, and Strumilo responds with d5, the Scandinavian defense. Of course, this is 1922, and I think in 1922, and for much of this opening's history, it would have been known as the center counter more likely than the Scandinavian. Now, we get pawn takes d5, and not the most common move, queen takes d5, but an excellent second choice, knight to f6. White now plays knight c3, which is a little bit of a dubious move. You really don't want to block the pawn here on c2. White's most challenging options involve playing both c4 and d4. But of course, White still has a decent position. Black captures on d5, and White plays bishop c4. Now, Black should capture here on c3. You should give White the doubled pawns. It's not like the doubled pawns are horrible, but they are also not great, and you should give them to White. Instead, Black pulls back with knight to b6. The bishop also pulls back bishop b3, knight c6, knight f3, and now the best continuation is, as is often the case with the Scandinavian, a solid continuation. Bishop to f5, simply developing here, getting the bishop out of the pawn chain, and then readying pawn to e6, which also frees this bishop. That also will blunt this bishop here on b3, and Black has a reasonable game, even if White is probably a bit better. Instead, Black makes an error, a very instructive one, pawn to e5. Why is this natural move an error? It certainly looks desirable to expand in the center, control d4, free this bishop right here, and not block this bishop here on c8. Well, the problem is that Black is not well developed enough for this pawn advance, and the pawn is now a target. White should play castles, and then rook e1 and d4 with a ton of pressure and a potentially crucial killing attack brewing. Now, Black might like to play, for example, pawn to f6 at some point to support this pawn, but that is going to open up this bishop and very likely lead to a crushing attack for White. Instead, after pawn to e5, White plays d3, which is also a good move, but by no means the most challenging. Black plays another inaccurate move, bishop to g4, going for the pin. What could be more natural? Now, the problem is that White can and does find the very strong and very sneaky pawn to h3. This move puts the question to the bishop, and what Black should do is capture here on f3. Bishop takes f3, and queen takes f3. But of course, Black doesn't want to give up the bishop pair and also develop the white queen, which is now threatening checkmate. But this was forced. Instead, Black plays bishop h5, trying to retain the pin right here on the knight on f3 to the queen on d1. The problem now is that the bishop is loose on h5, whereas on g4, it was loose, but if White tried this trick, which now works, the brilliant knight takes e5, then Black would be able to recapture and defend a bishop on g4, but not a bishop on h5. After knight takes e5, it turns out that White is winning, but it's only possible to say that in a simple way because we now have stockfish. Of course, pre-stockfish, it took a lot of analysis to prove something like this. This is not the kind of Legal's mate that you might be familiar with, where White is forcing checkmate in like 3 moves. White is going to need a lot of precise and clever play from here to prove that this queen sacrifice and king hunt does work. Now, in this position, of course, we're looking for Black to accept the queen sacrifice. But black does have a better option. More tenacious is queen to h4. Bringing the queen out, maintaining the bishop on h5 where it defends the f7 pawn, and accepting the loss of a pawn which white can consolidate with a move like knight f3, but not giving up anything further. Of course, we're all very glad that black didn't play in this tenacious way and instead took the queen on d1. And of course, queen h4 is probably also losing in the end. After bishop takes d1, we see bishop takes f7 check. The king is forced to e7. We see bishop to g5 check, a skewer, but white has no intention of capturing on d8. After the forced king d6, if you did capture on d8, then there's simply knight takes e5, and black is up a piece, and white has many more pieces hanging, and without the queen, in this position, there's no hope of checkmate, and you're simply losing as white. So after king d6, white must throw more material onto the fire here and continue with knight to e4 check, sacrificing the knight on e5 as well and fully committing to the idea of checkmating the black king. Black's king is forced further up the board and capturing the knight, and now pawn to f4 check, and for the first time since the queen has been sacrificed, black actually has a choice. Black can pick between f5 and d4, but it's not much of a choice because after king f5, you have knight g3 and checkmate is on the board. This is a very, very pretty checkmate with the minor pieces. The bishops are working together perfectly to cover all of these squares. The pawns are beautifully covering these light squares, and the knight is giving the deadly check right here. Also, the pawn on f4, critical as well. A magnificent possible mating position. Now, of course, black sees this checkmated one and goes king d4 instead. Now, if this was a king of the hill game, black would have already won by now, but it's not, and having your king so centralized is a huge problem. But white in this position can no longer continue with forcing moves. If you play c3 check, then black is able to capture on d3. Black has room to run, and it is black who is winning in this position. So white must slow down and play rook takes d1. It's not even so important to capture the bishop here. I mean, it's nice that you've captured a piece, but what's more important is developing the rook and defending d3 to threaten pawn to c3 and, well, checkmate very, very soon. After rook takes d1, there are options, I guess, for black, but they're not very good. For example, black could play bishop to b4 check, and then you have c3, bishop takes, pawn takes, king e3, and white has lines that are very similar to what happens in the game. For example, castles, which is going to be an idea we see in the game, and the idea of mate here is very, very hard to stop. Knight d4 is a clever try, saying, please take me and let my king run back into the middle of the board. But here white can just play knight g3, covering e2, so black can't play knight e2 check, and you're preparing rook to e1, leading to checkmate. It's mate in 7 at the most, according to Stockfish. Now, after rook takes d1, black actually tries king to e3, running right into the middle of the board with the king. It's really funny to see the king voluntarily step further into the center here like this, but there's not really a better option, so it's interesting enough. We see now castles, getting ready for the idea of rook to e1, and really various other checkmating ideas, and pawn to c3. After castles, we see knight to d4, readying the idea we've already seen of knight to e2 to block these checks with a rook. There are a few ways for white to win here, but the fastest wins are with the check on e1. In fact, both rook checks lead to forced mate, but white needs very, very clever ideas in both cases, and they are different ideas. The fastest, not played in the game, is rook f to e1 check. Now knight e2, rook takes e2, you have to sacrifice an exchange, throwing more wood on the fire here, king takes e2, and now knight to c3, checking the king and also defending the rook here on d1. After knight c3 check, the king pulls back to e3, and this is a great moment to pause your video. There is one and only one winning move here, and it is not easy to see. It is d4, another brilliant idea. Now, the idea of d4 is rook to d3 checkmate. Also, the advanced d4 prevents black's king from escaping to the d4 square. After d4, there's no way to save the game, and it is mate in 2 at the most. There are 2 different mates I like here. There's queen takes on d4, and then pawn to f5 check, a discovered check that only works now because earlier black could have played queen takes g5. Black must block with queen f4, and now rook d3 is checkmate. Very beautiful. Also, after d4, black could try capturing on g5 instead, eliminating the bishop, giving back material, something black has been so desperate to do. But here, you're not capturing the queen, of course. You're playing rook d3 check when king takes f4 is forced, and then you have rook to f3. Another beautiful, beautiful checkmate. And I find it really special that the queen here on g5 just hanging out is preventing black from escaping and easily winning the game. So in the actual game, we don't see these checkmates, but we see other beautiful checkmates. It is the d rook that checks on e1. Still knight e2 check, rook takes on e2, king takes on e2, and here knight c3 is no longer so good. Black has more options to evade, including king to d2 and king takes c2. So here you need a different check, bishop h5 check. Now after bishop h5 check, the king is forced back to e3, and here, if the rook were on d1, then white wouldn't actually be able to finish things off. But with the rook on f1, white has a new check available, rook f3 check. The king is forced back to d4, and in this position, I again encourage you to pause your video and try to find the decisive move. Here, the critical move, the winning move, is bishop to f7. Another brilliant idea. Black was looking to escape to d5, and this bishop now prevents that escape. I often teach students that checkmate is 2 combined concepts. Check, an attack on the king, and mate, which is covering all of the king's escape squares. When you're learning, you focus on check. It's forcing and it feels powerful. But in fact, the mate part, covering all of the 8 possible escape squares, is much, much harder. Bishop f7, as is often the case in king hunts, is exactly the kind of move that you need, focused on the mate, the coverage of the escape squares, and not the check. You have many checks available, and most of them don't work. After bishop f7, there's no way to stop checkmate. It's mate in 2 at most. Black tried knight d5, and then c3 check was played, knight takes c3, pawn takes c3, and checkmate. A beautiful finish to a beautiful game with tons of beautiful variations. I really hope that you've enjoyed this game, and if you want to see more of my top 10 chess games of the 1920s, then simply click on that playlist that is popping up on your screen as I speak.